When I started this channel, I said it would primarily be a Final Fantasy channel, and trust me, more content is going to come from the series, but something has been on my mind lately. For the last few weeks, I've been playing a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy of the Duelist Link Evolution for my Switch. For those who don't know, this used to be a Yu-Gi-Oh! Channel several years ago. I have zero intention of making this into a Yu-Gi-Oh! Channel again, but it's fun to go back and play decks I used to enjoy before I stopped playing the game. Mermails are even still viable. After dozens of hours of play, something felt off. Something about the design of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the way the cards are designed, the way the game is played, it all just feels off and sloppy. All of it made me come to the realization that I don't think that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a good competitive game. It's still fun, and fun is the entire point of games, but that doesn't make it good as a competitive game. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a number of issues, and I don't want to make the entire video about it, but in short, the game is far too fast, the lack of required resources completely breaks any semblance of balancing cards against each other, and the lack of a rotating format basically requires the game to power creep. The point of this video isn't to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! The game got me thinking though. What makes a game good as a competitive game? Competition is almost as old as games themselves. Before we even talk about video games, the idea of competition is at its core the essence of the idea of games. When we play single-player games, we're competing either against a computer, a pre-prescribed enemy, or the rules of the game themselves. Traditional games like sports are inherently competitive. Every sport is based around the concept of an individual or a team competing against each other. These games appeal to very human instincts. Humans like to win. We like to be seen. We like the glory of being the best. Games and sports add something very important to the human desire to compete. Games and sports are social activities. Above anything else, human beings are social animals. We thrive on interacting with other people. Competitive games are a way to take our urge to win and make it a social bonding experience. There's something very instinctive about the need for play between human beings. Competition itself doesn't make a game fun or work well as a competitive game, though. If we're going to talk about what makes a game a good competitive game, we're going to need to go all the way back to this. If we're going to talk about a good competitive game, we need to strip all the variables away. Pong is close to as simple as a game could possibly be. It's a more simplistic version of tennis. There is no out of bounds, there is no odd scoring system, there is no net or guidelines about where to hit the ball. There are simply two paddles and a ball. There is one rule: make it to 10 points. Pong has endured and been replicated over and over again because it is the perfect distillation of a competitive game. Both players are on equal footing. No player has a faster paddle or an ability another doesn't. There are no factors of randomness. There are no quirks in the rules that could allow a player to win on a technicality. There are no frills or gimmicks. It is as pure a competition as a game can be. This simplicity is what makes it so good as a competitive game. At best, players should be evenly equipped without any outside factors contributing to one player winning or losing. That's not to say that randomness can't ever be a part of a competitive game, as most card games have some element of randomness. But how much randomness is allowed to sway the outcome of the game should be kept to a minimum. There are exceptions, though, that take full advantage of randomness. Games like poker hinge the entire game around the randomness element, although the card game taking place is not the meta to a game of poker. Poker's metagame hinges on the gambling. Without gambling, the game takes knowledge but involves a large amount of luck and chance, making it not something suited to a serious competitive game. The element of gambling adds a factor that can be controlled and adds strategy that a player can implement against the other players at the table. The idea of randomness impacting the purity of the competition can be perfectly demonstrated in both Mario Kart and Super Smash Bros. Mario Kart's random elements are so disruptive, they strip a lot of the element of skill away from the game. The AI will randomly decide to just become better at the game, and the items you get are random and scale in effectiveness to the place you're in. Players will find themselves playing incredibly well only to get knocked into lower places at the last minute due to a factor completely outside of their control. Mario Kart is a racing game in mechanics only, but functions more like a party game. There's a reason Mario Kart isn't a competitive esport. Smash includes, on the surface, multiple random elements. The stages have hazards, the items randomly spawn, and certain items like the Pokeball even have their own micro-randomness to them. However, Smash gives you the option to disable items and select specific, non-random stages and turn the stage hazards off entirely. Mario Kart 8 allowed you to disable items as well, but that hasn't been an option for the majority of the series. The random elements become completely player-dependent. Mostly. This version of the game is one of the deepest, most exciting fighting games ever released. Stripping away the randomness reveals the excellent game underneath it all. Talking about fighting games brings up a concept that is a core fundamental part of the genre and something that I feel is the biggest element that makes up a good competitive game: neutral. Neutral is the most fundamental of all fighting game concepts. Ignoring technical skill, neutral is the game. It describes a state where both players are exchanging hits, where no one player has a true advantageous position. Players are interacting with each other, but no one is clearly winning. The concept of neutral exists in every competitive game, whether it's a fighting game or not. The neutral state of Pong is when both players are batting the ball back and forth. The neutral of Magic the Gathering is the early part of the game when both players are building their boards. Neutral is a key part of a game because it allows both players a chance to interact with each other and for the flow of the game to move back and forth. If a game allows a player to develop an overwhelming advantage early, the game lacks neutral and becomes boring. It starts to become more about who landed the first hit or took the first turn. This goes back to what I was saying about Yu-Gi-Oh! The game is blisteringly fast, to the point where a player on the first turn of the game is able to completely lock out their opponent. There are certainly ways around this, but on average, games of Yu-Gi-Oh! Don't last very long. A close friend of mine in college played both Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic the Gathering, and shared with me that she much preferred Magic because she, quote, felt like she at least had a chance. This is not the first or last time someone had expressed a similar sentiment to me. If Magic the Gathering represents the intricate neutral decisions of Street Fighter or Tekken, then Yu-Gi-Oh! Represents dive kick. For an analogy that's a little less niche, imagine you're playing chess. Chess is a good game because of the intricate strategy that's involved in its gameplay, but if one of the players had a piece that could teleport straight to the king every turn, it would lose a lot of its appeal. Magic the Gathering infamously had Combo Winter, a metagame during Urza Block where decks became so fast and powerful that games could end before the other player even took their first turn of the game. Breaks like this not only take the fun out of the game, but they fundamentally ruin the competitiveness of play. For my money, there is no genre of game that perfectly encapsulates the competitive spirit like fighting games. As far as the size of the esports communities, fighting games make up a very small portion of the overall esports scene. Prize pools at these tournaments aren't exactly making news headlines the same way that Fortnite does. However, there's truly no experience quite the same as watching EVO Grand Finals. There's something incredibly unique to the culture of fighting games compared to other games. In fighting games, with some exceptions, the story of the players is always a one-on-one bout. Watching the players walk up to each other on the stage is the same feeling of watching Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed facing off. It's not a test of teamwork, it's a test of individual skill. These games are the greatest representation of the competitive spirit. There are upsets, amazing stories of underdogs and up-and-comers, and some of the most amazing esports highlights ever recorded. These moments are all possible because of how good they are as competitive games. They represent the simplicity that goes all the way back to games like Pong. Instead of 2 paddles, it's 2 characters. Instead of a ball, they have fists. There are no obstacles in the way or random elements. The goal is as simple as getting 10 points. Deplete your opponent's health bar or knock out their stocks. Fighting games' complexity comes from the amount of things you as a character can do and how you're able to combat and counter what your opponent does. Your ability to read your opponent, think ahead of them, and plan accordingly is what makes the difference between winning and losing. This leads to something else that makes a competitive game good: options. Even in games like Pong, as the ball comes to you, you have options. You can simply pass the ball back by not moving the paddle. You can also hit the ball while moving to make the ball bounce at an angle. You can straighten a hit from an opponent. There is strategy available to you. Every move you make is either an action or a reaction. Other games that work as competitive games exhibit similar layers of decision-making, however on a much larger scale. In an average game of Super Smash Bros., decisions are being made 60 times per second. People who play Melee have inputs and decisions planned down to the last frame, with some common techniques requiring extreme precision. The decision tree an average player makes while fighting is a massive network labyrinth of choices, all to accomplish the act of a fox kicking a bird.
Come on!
Without options, gameplay becomes linear. Linearity is not an inherently bad thing, and restricting available options can create an interesting metagame, but when you restrict things too much, the game becomes predictable and boring. If variety is the spice of life, then unpredictability and available options are the butter and heat source. Everyone has at some point picked up a fighting game and looked up the character move list and been paralyzed by seeing a long list of button commands. Everyone has also played New Super Mario Bros. And felt the game to be shallow. The median between these two is where the perfect competitive spirit lies. You want depth and a feeling of improvement. You want new techniques to emerge, new metagame-defining strategies, new characters to emerge as top-level choices. These are all factors of another major element: evolution. The movement and flow of a competitive game is not just in patches or added content, but in the change of the metagame itself. A competitive game doesn't exist solely in a vacuum. The game itself changes from community input. You want a game to be dynamic. You want to have enough options in the game and the game to be balanced enough for the metagame to constantly evolve. Without that evolution, the game becomes solved, and it stops being interesting. Games are kept alive and exciting at the discovery of new techniques, new metagame counters, and new strategies that force players to adapt. The game acts as a series of tools for players to experiment and use in an average game. The players use the tools available not on the game itself, but on each other. Tools need to be adaptable or serve multiple purposes, or the game hits that wall of linearity. Competitive games are more than just a way to beat up your friends. They're like any other form of art, which brings me to one last point: self-expression. There's a reason why you can identify Mango's playstyle from Magi or Wizrobe from None. There's a reason why Luis Scott Vargas is so celebrated in Magic. There's a reason why so many people flock to these kinds of games. We're drawn to the expression that these games give us. They let us put a part of ourselves into what we do. They're a way we can add our own flair and discover our own style and techniques. They're also a way to beat up our friends. However, there's never been a better and more creative and fun way to do so.